"That dog is not guarding the door," Garrick Valancourt said. "He is guarding us from what is beneath it." 30 years after the graduating class of 1994 had scattered across Canada, they gathered again beneath the amber lights of Bellwether Collegiate, an aging brick school surrounded by black spruce and the cold northern silence of Ontario. Outside, wet snow slid from the eaves in heavy drops. Inside, old classmates raised glasses, traded softened memories, and laughed beneath photographs of faces that time had changed. Near the eastern corridor, Principal Alastair Crow stood beneath a banner, welcoming everyone home. His silver hair was neat, his smile calm, his voice polished by decades of assemblies and carefully chosen words. Garrick watched him from across the hall. At 48, the former United States Marine and retired financial investigator still carried himself like a man listening for danger after everyone else had relaxed. Beside him walked Morrow, his 9-year-old German shepherd, dark sable along the spine, silver beginning around the muzzle, amber eyes steady beneath alert ears. Morrow had searched collapsed buildings, tracked missing people through winter bush, and learned that silence often carried more warning than noise. He had been quiet all evening. Then the third bell rang. It came from the old brass clock above the gymnasium doors. One low note, a pause, then two more, each trembling through the floorboards like something waking beneath the school. At the far end of the corridor, Aveline Corbeil stopped breathing. She had entered the reunion without announcement, accompanied only by Tamsin Beaulieu, the social worker who had spent 2 years listening to the story everyone else had dismissed. Aveline wore a charcoal coat buttoned her throat. Her hair had gone mostly gray, yet her face still carried the careful stillness of the 17-year-old girl whose graduation photograph had once appeared in every shop window beneath the word missing. 30 years ago, the town had decided she stole scholarship money and fled. Tonight, whispers followed her like frost. Morrow turned toward the eastern exit, his head lowered, one paw pressed against the faded tile. A group of former students approached the door, eager to reach the parking lot before the snow thickened. Morrow stepped across their path. He did not bark. He simply stood there, broad chest square to the doorway. "Easy, old fellow," Crow said, forcing a laugh. "Perhaps he is confused." Garrick saw the tension gather along Morrow's shoulders. "He is not." A man tried to pass on the left. Morrow shifted left. A woman moved toward the right. The dog blocked her too, then looked back at Garrick with the precise, unwavering stare he had used during structural searches. Garrick knelt and placed his palm against the floor. At first, he felt only the chill of old stone. Then a faint vibration traveled beneath his hand. Hollow, uneven, wrong. "Nobody crosses," he said. The laughter in the hall faded. A maintenance engineer tapped the tiles with a metal bar. The first strike sounded solid. The second returned a thin echo. On the third, something beneath the threshold answered with a deep, empty knock. Aveline moved closer, trembling. Snowlight touched her face through the narrow window. Her gaze settled on the wooden frame, where decades of paint had begun to peel. Garrick brushed away a loose gray flake. Beneath it, carved into the wood, was a small pine tree with 3 branches. Aveline covered her mouth. For 30 years, medication, isolation, and official records had taught her to fear her own memory. But she knew that mark. She had drawn it with an old caretaker named Osmond Laframboise when they chose 3 places where truth might survive if people did not. Her voice came softly, almost lost beneath the hum of the lights. Ozzy chose the 3rd place. Morrow remained before the door, motionless as stone, while beneath his paws the forgotten floor held its breath. 3 hours earlier, before Morrow stopped beneath the eastern doorway, Garrick had driven into Bellwether Falls beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Snowbanks, softened by an early thaw, lined the Tulane Road in gray ridges, and a spruce forest pressed close to the town as if guarding what remained hidden there. Bellwether Collegiate stood at the northern edge, its red brick darkened by age, its Canadian flag snapping weakly in the wind. Garrick parked beside the gymnasium and rested one hand on Morrow's shoulder. The old German shepherd looked toward the school without moving. "Just a reunion," Garrick murmured. Morrow's ears lifted, though neither of them believed it. Garrick had been born in Ontario, but his family moved to Michigan when he was 16. The United States Marine Corps shaped the years that followed, and investigative work shaped the man who came home. Inside, the corridors smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and coffee poured from silver urns. Name tags waited on a folding table beneath a banner printed with the class year. Garrick found his card beside the photograph of a boy he barely recognized as himself. In those days, his face had been open, his future still unbroken. He clipped the card to his jacket and followed Morrow toward the assembly hall. Along one wall stood enlarged pages from the old yearbook. Football teams, debate clubs, graduation portraits. Then Garrick saw Avellini Corbeil. Someone had drawn a black line across her face. Beneath the photograph, a yellowed newspaper clipping claimed she had vanished with scholarship funds on graduation night. She had never been charged, let alone convicted, yet the town had carried the accusation longer than it carried her name. "They left that up?" a woman asked behind him. Garrick turned. Tamsin Boyu stood beside Avellini, one hand near her elbow, without touching it. Avellini was thinner than Garrick remembered, her gray hair pinned simply, her posture careful. The room noticed her one person at a time. Conversations weakened. Glasses lowered. A former classmate stared openly, then looked away. Another whispered that she must have returned for attention. Avellini heard them. Her expression did not change. Morrow crossed the space between them and stopped before her. He sniffed her hand, then sat beside her left leg. Avellini looked down at him. "He does not know me. He knows enough," Garrick said. Principal Alastair Crow approached with a smile shaped for public occasions. "Avellini," he said, extending his hand. "We are pleased to see you looking well." She did not take it. "I came to learn whether I ever was." Crow's smile remained, but the warmth left his eyes. Tamsin opened a worn leather folder and passed Garrick a copy of Avellini's intake record from St. Orzan Recovery House, a private facility almost 80 kilometers north of town. The document claimed she had been admitted at 10:40 that evening. Then Tamsin showed him a still image taken from a surviving local cable broadcast of the graduation ceremony. A clock in the corner of the recording read 10:52. Avellini could be seen crossing the eastern corridor, alive, awake, and still inside the school 12 minutes after the clinic claimed custody of her. Garrick raised his eyes. Across the hall, Crow was watching him. Morrow rose slowly. For the first time that evening, the old dog turned toward the eastern wing. Tamsin led Garrick and Avellini into the old guidance office, where the walls still held the pale outlines of frames removed years ago. Morrow settled near the door, but his eyes remained fixed on the eastern corridor beyond the frosted glass. On the desk, Tamsin arranged copies of intake forms, school ledgers, and handwritten notes collected over 2 years with Avellini's written consent. "Her story changes at the edges," she said, "but never at the center." Avellini stood by the window, watching snowmelt gather along the sill. "3 safe places," she said quietly. "A pine tree with 3 branches. The 3rd bell." Garrick opened his notebook. "Tell me only what you are certain of." She closed her eyes. The costume storage room behind the stage. The old boiler room. The service space beneath the eastern doors. Her fingers tightened against the sleeve of her coat. Osmond Laframboise knew all 3. We called him Ozzy. He fixed lockers, cleared snow, and noticed when students went hungry. Tamsin slid forward a photocopy of a scholarship ledger from 1994. Several names had been crossed out. Beside them were payments to maintenance companies that no longer existed. Avellini had been a student assistant in the school office. She had found that money intended for low-income students was being moved through false repair contracts and private donations. At first, she thought it was an accounting error. Then she saw Alastair Crow's initials beside every transfer. "I copied the ledger pages and the contracts," she said. "I recorded him when he asked me to stop looking. I also wrote draft letters for the school board and the Ontario Provincial Police." Garrick glanced toward the hallway. "What did you give Ozzy?" "A duplicate set of the financial records, 1 cassette, and the draft letters. I told him to choose one of the 3 places if I did not return before the 3rd bell." Why trust him? Because he once paid for a student's winter boots and told everyone they had been found in lost property. A small warmth touched her voice, then vanished. Garrick asked why she had not gone to the police first. Avellini looked at him for a long moment. I tried, years later. I escaped the facility and walked 6 kilometers to a roadside station. They read my medical file before they listened to me. By nightfall, I was back behind the same locked door. No anger sharpened the words. That made them heavier. Garrick lowered his eyes. During his years as an investigator, he had once trusted a clinical report over a frightened witness. The case had followed him ever since, not because he had broken a rule, but because he had obeyed one without mercy. We check all 3 places, he said. We trust what the building gives us. Morrow rose at the sound of his voice. Avellini watched the dog move to Garrick's side. Can he find paper after 30 years? No, Garrick said, but he can find hollow spaces, weakened flooring, old metal, and places people try to seal. Tamsin unfolded the renovation schedule. Crews would begin demolition at 7 the next morning. The costume room, boiler room, and eastern entrance were all marked for removal. Avellini stared at the page, as though someone had placed a clock in front of her. Morrow crossed the office and stopped beneath a framed photograph of Ozzy. He sniffed the wooden edge once, then turned toward the eastern wing. This time, he did not wait for Garrick to follow. Morrow moved through the corridor with the quiet certainty of an animal following something older than scent. Garrick kept the lead loose, allowing the German shepherd to choose his pace, while Avellini and Tamsin followed several steps behind. The costume storage room lay beyond the assembly stage, where faded curtains smelled of dust, canvas, and cedar blocks. Rows of old uniforms hung beneath plastic covers. Painted trees, cardboard castles, and broken lamps leaned against the walls like abandoned memories. Avellini stopped before a narrow cabinet near the rear exit. On its lower panel, almost hidden beneath scratches, was the pine tree with 3 branches. Her breath caught. Garrick examined the lock, then asked the caretaker on duty to open it. Inside were cracked masks, a box of rusted hinges, and a stack of programs for school plays. Nothing else. No hidden panel. No metal container. No poppers. Avellini ran her fingers over the carved symbol. I marked it, she whispered. But Ozzy did not choose it. The certainty in her voice lasted only a moment. Principal Crow appeared at the doorway, his hands folded calmly before him. This building is old, he said. There are safety rules, insurance concerns, and guess who came here to remember happier things. Garrick looked at him. Then they should be grateful we are checking. Crow smiled without answering. The boiler room was reached by a stairwell beneath the science wing. Warm air rose from below, carrying the smell of iron, damp concrete, and machine oil. The room had been modernized years earlier, but one section of brick remained from the original structure. Morrow crossed to it, nose moving quickly. He scratched once at the base. Hope returned to Avellini's face so suddenly that Garrick felt afraid for her. A maintenance worker removed a loose panel and found only old insulation, mouse nesting, and a narrow service pipe. Behind another brick was an empty toolbox, its lid bent with age. Nothing bore Ozzy's handwriting. Nothing connected Crow to the missing funds. The silence that followed was worse than disappointment. Avellini lowered herself onto a wooden bench. Perhaps I made the rest of it fit, she said. Perhaps the bells, the marks, all of it. Tamsin crouched beside her. You remember the intake time. You remembered the 3 places. People can remember a dream for 30 years. Crow stepped closer and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Memory can be merciful, Avellini. Let be. Morrow moved before Garrick could speak. He placed his body between them, forcing Crow to withdraw his hand. The dog did not growl. He only watched. Garrick turned toward Crow. You knew we would come to the boiler room. It was an obvious place. No, Garrick said. It was one of 3 places, and nobody named it in front of you. A pipe clicked somewhere behind the wall. Crow's expression remained composed, but the color beneath his cheeks faded. You searched these rooms before, Garrick continued. Back in 1994. Crow's eyes shifted toward the open brickwork. It lasted less than a second, but Garrick saw it. "You found her original list after she fell," he said. "You searched the costume room and the boiler room, but not the Eastern Service space." Avellini slowly raised her head. Crow said nothing. He did not need to. His silence had already answered too much. 30 years earlier, rain pressed against the windows of Bellwether Collegiate while the graduation dance continued beneath paper stars in the gymnasium. Avellini was 17, wearing a navy dress her mother had altered by hand and a silver locket that rested against her throat. Music drifted through the corridor, softened by distance. She carried a canvas school bag against her side. Inside were photocopied ledger pages, false maintenance contracts, and her original cassette recorder wrapped in a scarf. Earlier that evening, she had given Osmond Laframboise a duplicate set of the financial records, a second cassette, and draft letters addressed to the school board and the Ontario Provincial Police. She had also shown him a small handwritten list naming the costume storage room, the boiler room, and the service space beneath the eastern doors. If she did not return before the third bell, he was to choose one location and hide everything. The eastern corridor was nearly empty when Alistair Crow called her name. He was younger then, not yet principal, but he already wore authority like a tailored coat. "You have been asking questions that do not concern you," he said. Avellini pressed the recorder button through the fabric of her pocket. "Scholarship money concerns every student who was promised help." Crow closed the office door behind them. He explained that funds had been redirected temporarily, that donors expected favors, and that schools survived through arrangements students could not understand. Avellini placed photocopied ledger pages on the desk. "These companies share the same mailing address." His eyes changed, not with surprise, with recognition. He asked who else had seen the papers. "Enough people," she answered. It was not true, but she needed him to believe it. Beyond the wall, the old clock mechanism misfired after a power surge. One bell sounded, then another, then a third, low and uneven. Crow reached for the canvas bag. Avellini pulled it back. The strap caught against a chair, and both of them stumbled into the maintenance corridor. A narrow service door stood open beside the stairwell. Crow seized the bag again. Avellini stepped away, missed the edge of the first metal step, and fell several meters to the landing below. The world flashed white, then returned in pieces. Rainwater ticked through a pipe. Her head throbbed, but she remained awake. "Call an ambulance," she whispered. Crow stood above her holding the torn bag. The cassette recorder lay near his shoe, still turning. He picked it up, then found the handwritten list folded inside the bag. His eyes moved across the 3 locations. "An ambulance creates questions," he said. He gathered the papers and telephoned Dr. Mireille Dagonet instead. Less than an hour later, a dark station wagon stopped behind the school. Avellini was placed inside beneath a blanket. No paramedic examined her. No family member was called. Ozzy watched from the boiler room window as the vehicle crossed the rear parking lot. Avellini lifted one hand against the glass. She was conscious. She was asking for help. After the taillights disappeared into the rain, Ozzy returned to the eastern corridor and found a folded note near the stairwell. On it, Avellini had written 3 lines. "Third bell, 3 branches. Keep one alive." That same night, he sealed the duplicate records, the cassette, and the draft letters inside a metal container beneath the eastern doorway. Over the next 2 days, he added the license plate, the name St. Orzin, and his own sign account. Crow searched the costume room and boiler room during the following days. When he inspected the eastern entrance, he found only an old maintenance plate sealed beneath layers of paint and assumed the service space had been closed years earlier. He never realized Ozzy had hidden the container behind it. 3 days later, while clearing wet snow from the school steps, Ozzy suffered a sudden cardiac arrest and died before he could decide whom to trust. The town buried him without knowing he had buried the truth first. By the time the reunion music softened into its final song, freezing rain had begun tapping against the eastern windows. Garrick had asked the guests to remain inside the assembly hall until the building engineer arrived from the Municipal Works Depot, 22 kilometers away. Crow objected at first, speaking of inconvenience, liability, and roads that would soon glaze over. Garrick listened without answering. Morrow stood beside him, facing the eastern corridor. The German shepherd had stopped watching Crow. Now he watched the floor. Avellini walked slowly along the wall, her fingers hovering over old trophy cases and painted bricks without touching them. Each step seemed to draw something from a place in her mind that had been locked for decades. The light was flickering, she said. That night, near the service door. Tamsin remained close. Do you remember anything else? Avellini shook her head. Only the bells. The first bell sounded from the clock above the gymnasium. Its lone note traveled through the corridor and settled into the old building. Morrow lifted his head. He moved forward, not sniffing the air but listening. His paws crossed the faded tiles one careful step at a time. The second bell rang. Morrow stopped near the eastern exit and shifted his weight onto his front legs. His ears angled toward the floor. Beneath the distant voices and the hum of fluorescent lights came a faint tremor, too soft for anyone else to notice. Then the third bell sounded. Several guests, impatient to reach their vehicles, approached the exit. Morrow stepped across the doorway. A man in a wool coat tried to pass around him. The dog shifted left. A woman carrying a silver gift bag moved toward the opposite side. Morrow blocked her as well. Garrick, Crow said sharply, control your animal. Garrick saw a thin crack move across the grout beneath Morrow's paw. Nobody crosses. One guest laughed nervously and stepped forward. The tile shifted under the approaching shoe. Morrow stepped backward at once, catching Garrick's sleeve and pulling him with the movement. A soft snapping sound came from beneath the floor. Everyone became still. The engineer arrived moments later, carrying a portable scanner and a metal testing bar. He examined the doorway, then asked the group to move at least 5 meters back. The first scan showed a weakened support beam. The second revealed an empty chamber beneath the threshold, nearly 1 meter deep and absent from the current plans. This floor could fail under a crowd, he said. Morrow had not found paper. He had found danger. Yet when the engineer scraped away paint from the lower doorframe, another truth appeared. 3 narrow branches rose from a single carved trunk. Avellini stared at the symbol as if someone had returned a word stolen from her childhood. Ozzy, she whispered. The engineer lifted 2 tiles and removed a corroded steel plate fixed beneath them. Cold air escaped from the darkness below. Garrick aimed his flashlight into the chamber. Dust covered old cables, a broken junction box, and something rectangular pushed against the far wall. He reached down carefully and drew out a rusted metal container. Across its lid, written in faded black marker, were 8 words. For the third bell, in case she survives. Garrick carried the metal container into the guidance office and placed it beneath the white light of an old desk lamp. Rust had sealed the edges, so the engineer worked carefully with a narrow tool until the lid loosened. With a soft breath of trapped air, Avellini stood across from the desk, both hands pressed together. Morrow remained beside her, his shoulder touching her knee, as if he understood that whatever waited inside had already taken enough from her. The first item was a ledger wrapped in wax cloth. Its pages were dry, the ink faded but clear. Garrick turned them slowly. Scholarship payments intended for students from low-income families had been redirected through 3 maintenance companies. Each company used the same post office box in Sudbury. Beside every transfer were the initials A.C. Crow said nothing from the doorway. Tamsin opened a second bundle. Inside were photocopied contracts and draft letters Avellini had prepared before graduation night for the school board and the Ontario Provincial Police. One described the false companies. Another named the students whose scholarships had vanished. The wording was careful, factual, and unmistakably written by someone trying to be believed. Avellini touched the top page, but did not lift it. I remember writing this, she said. I thought facts would be enough. Beneath the letters lay a cassette tape labeled Graduation Night. The school still kept an old player in the media cupboard, and a caretaker brought it within minutes. Garrick pressed the button. Static filled the room. Then came Avellini's younger voice, steady despite fear. She asked about the companies. Crow answered that scholarship funds had been moved temporarily. He warned her that accusations could damage her family. The tape caught the scrape of a chair, the sound of hurried movement, and the 3 bells rolling through the corridor. Then Avellini's voice became faint. "Please call an ambulance." A pause followed. Crow's younger voice answered. "An ambulance creates questions." No one moved. Even the reunion guests gathered beyond the glass seemed to stop breathing. The final item was a statement written by Osmond Laframboise and signed 2 days after Avellini disappeared. He described seeing her placed into a dark station wagon while conscious. He recorded the license plate, the name St. Orzin printed on an envelope, and the time the vehicle left. The school. At the bottom, he had written, "I saved the truth because I was too frightened to save the girl." Tamsin opened a separate archival file she had obtained from St. Orzin with Avellini's written consent. Inside were letters Avellini had written after her confinement began, each marked as received, but never mailed. One began with the words, "I am not missing. I am being kept somewhere north of Bellwether." The license plate in Ozzy's statement belonged to a company linked to one of Crow's donors. The admission form had been completed before Avellini arrived. The guardian's signature matched no member of her family. The school's private foundation transferred funds to St. Orzin 4 days later. Garrick placed each item in a clear sleeve. "This does not stand alone," he said. "It connects. Ledger to company, company to donor, donor to vehicle, vehicle to facility, facility to false admission." Crow stepped into the room at last. His face had lost its public calm. He looked at the open container, then at Avellini. "There was no second set," he whispered. Garrick held his gaze. "You only thought you took everything she had." Crow's whisper traveled beyond the guidance office and into the corridor, where former classmates stood beneath the weak fluorescent lights. No one spoke. Garrick watched the principal's face carefully. Panic could produce words that vanished by morning, but evidence had weight. Evidence could be sealed, tested, and carried into daylight. "You should choose your next words carefully," Garrick said. Crow straightened his jacket as though dignity could still be restored by habit. "An old tape proves nothing. It could have been altered." Osmond drank. Avellini had documented psychiatric symptoms. Avellini flinched, but Morrow pressed closer to her leg. Garrick placed the St. Orzin intake form beside the graduation video still. The facility recorded her arrival at 10:40 in the evening. This local cable recording places her inside the school at 10:52. He added the payment record. 4 days later, the school's private foundation transferred 40,000 Canadian dollars to St. Orzin through a consulting agreement. Then came the forged guardian form, the vehicle registration, the ledger bearing Crow's initials, and the letters that had been withheld. Each document landed softly on the desk. Each sound seemed louder than the last. Tamsin held the cassette, but did not touch the tape itself. 2 months ago, after Avellini described the bells again, I obtained the school's maintenance records. They confirmed that the clock had a damaged striker in 1994, producing the uneven third note she remembered. This recording will still require forensic examination, but the sound is consistent with those records. Crow looked toward the guests gathered outside. Many had believed his version for most of their lives. Some had repeated it to their children. One woman lowered her reunion glass to the floor. A man who had once laughed at Avellini's photograph removed his name tag and folded it in his hand. "This is not a courtroom," Crow said. "No, Garrikri Plaith. It is the room where your story stopped working." Faint red and blue light moved across the frosted windows. Tamsin had contacted the local Ontario Provincial Police Detachment as soon as the container was opened. 2 officers entered the corridor and secured the guidance office. The forensic identification unit would not reach Bellwether until later that night, so no one was permitted to touch the documents again. Crow saw the officers and seemed to shrink into his own silence. Avellini stepped forward. Her voice was quiet. "I do not need you to explain the money." Crow avoided her eyes. "I do not need you to explain the doctors, or the letters, or why nobody came when I called for my mother." She took another step. Morrow moved with her. "I need one answer." The building held still around them. Was I ever insane? Crow's face tightened. For 3 decades, he had hidden behind files written by people he paid, signatures made by hands that did not belong to her family, and diagnoses created before anyone examined her. Now, there was nowhere left to place the lie. "No," he said. The word barely carried across the office, but everyone heard it. Avellini closed her eyes. She did not cry. She simply breathed slowly and fully, as though returning to her own body after a very long absence. One of the officers informed Crow that he was being detained while investigators reviewed evidence of fraud, forgery, unlawful confinement, and obstruction. He offered no resistance. As he was escorted from the room, no one applauded. Near the yearbook display, an elderly classmate found a cloth and began rubbing the black ink from Avellini's graduation photograph. The stain did not vanish easily. It took patience. Avellini watched while the woman worked until her younger face slowly returned beneath the glass. For months later, winter had loosened its grip on Bellwether Falls. Snow still lingered beneath the black spruce, but water ran freely along the roadside ditches, carrying salt, pine needles, and the last gray fragments of ice toward the lake. The investigation had moved slowly, as truth often does after being buried for years. Forensic examination confirmed that the cassette had not been altered. Archive bank records showed that Alastair Crow had redirected scholarship funds through false maintenance contracts and companies connected to school donors. Files from St. Orzan proved that Avellini's diagnosis had been entered before she was examined. The guardian's signature belonged to no relative. Payments from the school foundation had continued, while her letters remained unopened in a locked archive. Crow was charged with fraud, forgery, obstruction of justice, and offenses connected to Avellini's unlawful confinement. Dr. Mireille Dagenet was also placed under investigation. None of it returned the years taken from Avellini. Justice can name what happened. It cannot give back every birthday, every winter, or every letter her mother never received. Still, the town began with the one thing it could restore: her name. The school board removed the accusation of theft from every official record. The old newspaper clipping disappeared from the yearbook display. In its place stood a simple plaque stating that Avellini Corbeil had exposed the misuse of funds intended for students in need. School board reserve funds, a provincial grant, and private donations established the Avellini Corbeil and Osmond Laframboise Scholarship for students without a voice. On the morning the Eastern Entrance reopened, the sky was clear and pale blue. The damaged floor had been rebuilt, but a small section of the original doorframe remained protected behind glass. Beneath it, the pine tree with 3 branches was still visible. Garrick arrived with Morrow walking slowly at his side. The old German shepherd's steps were stiffer now, and silver had spread farther across his muzzle, yet his amber eyes remained bright. Tamsin stood near the new doors. Avellini waited outside in a dark green coat, watching students gather in the corridor beyond the glass. Some carried backpacks. One held a violin case. Another wore winter boots purchased through the new scholarship. Avellini placed her hand against the door, but did not open it. For 30 years, that threshold had existed in her mind as the place where her voice disappeared. Garrick said nothing. Morrow moved ahead. His claws touched the repaired floor with soft, measured clicks. He crossed the doorway, stopped on the other side, and looked back at her. No command had been given. None was needed. Avellini opened the door. The first school bell rang above them. She stepped forward. The second followed as she passed beneath the preserved carving. On the third, she stopped beside Morrow and rested her hand against his neck. This time, nobody came to take her away. This time, the doors remained open. Students moved around her, their voices warm and ordinary, while morning light spread across the floor that had once hidden the truth. Garrick watched Avellini breathe in the scent of polished wood, melting snow, and fresh coffee from the staff room. She smiled, not because the past had become merciful, but because it no longer owned the final word. Morrow leaned gently against her leg. For 30 years, people had called her memory an illness. Yet truth had waited beneath rust, paint, and silence until one faithful animal refused to let the world walk over it again. Outside, the spruce trees moved in the northern wind. Inside, Avellini and Morrow crossed the eastern doorway together.